Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue au séminaire en informatique cognitive. Ça me fait grand plaisir de présenter notre invité de cette semaine, qui est Katy BÖRNER de l'Université de Indiana. Ses recherches portent sur le développement de techniques d'analyse et de visualisation de données pour l'accès, la compréhension et la gestion de l'information. Elle s'intéresse particulièrement à la formalisation, à la mesure et à l'amélioration systématique des connaissances en visualisation de données des humains, l'étude de la structure et de l'évolution des disciplines scientifiques, la construction et l'utilisation d'un atlas humain de référence, elle va en parler aujourd'hui, et le développement de cyberinfrastructures pour la collaboration scientifique et le calcul à grande échelle. Avec ça, ça me fait plaisir d'accueillir Katy BÖRNER qui va présenter un exposé intitulé « Atlas des prévisions, modèles et cartographie des avenirs souhaitables ». Katy, welcome to Montreal, and it's open to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for having me. And of course, it would be so much nicer in person, but this also works. And I think we are getting used to this global world where you can be in many places in one day. So thanks again for the invitation. I prepared a presentation which has 3 parts. I hope you can see my slides here. I will talk first about data visualizations of science. Then I will talk about the science of data visualization, how you can create them in a very scientific way. And then I will present some open challenges. Some of you might have seen that the Atlas trilogy has been completed. It's actually a massive set of books now. So there is a slipcase with everything, and it's wonderfully bound thanks to MIT Press. And we have been having a lot of fun interacting with all the map makers and macroscope makers that have been contributing to the exhibit over the many, many years that we have been bringing it to different places. And in 2021, we published the Atlas of Forecasts. By the way, it's a great Christmas present if you still need some. And it has a lot of knowledge. And I think it's good to give the gift of knowledge. As you also know, we have been bringing the exhibit to many places, including Montreal. And it's just wonderful to see it now also traveling again, not just virtually, but also physically to different places. And I always enjoy bringing the map to a new environment and then giving a curator's walk and talk through all these maps because they really open people's minds and hearts to the beauty of science and technology and education and many other things that we know are very valuable for our lives. Those of you which are not familiar with the exhibit, it's a now 20-year effort. The first 10 years are on maps of science and technology. And these are static large format maps. And there are 100 of them because we invited many map makers to submit each year. And then the top 10 were selected and basically manufactured and translated to a more general audience, and then printed and brought to many different venues around the globe. The second decade is on interactive macroscopes, and I will have a few examples there. And I think there will be a third decade also. So ultimately there will be 3 sets which are quite different from each other because the static maps you can just give to a librarian and they will preserve them for hundreds of years. The interactive data visualizations, it's hard to keep code alive even for 5 years because oftentimes that code accesses live data feeds, which might also change as time goes on. And of course, new insights are gained, and then some of the metaphors used to communicate data, for instance, about Afro-Americans, might not be appropriate so much anymore. So it's very interesting to deal with this evolving set of interactive data visualizations that degrade gracefully, let's say it's this way, but some of them are only having their full functionality in videos now because they cannot be updated regularly. Each one of them is probably $100,000 US to create, and then updating all of them would be an enormous amount of money. So coming to the back to the maps, I think many of you have seen this map of scientific collaborations. Science is highly connected throughout the world, and that's a good thing. And many of us are traveling, and we are kind of scientific diplomats and ambassadors for our countries. And of course, in some cases, you would expect to see more data in some of the empty areas here. And maybe it's just not covered properly in Elsevier's Scopus database. Maybe you have to bring in Chinese databases and others to really reflect all that research that is going on around the globe. We also started to map funding data because many people want to know if they would have a chance to submit a new proposal. You could just bring it into this map of all of the existing funded projects by NIH in 2007. You could fold in more recent years to see how that landscape changes as time passes. And you can also try to understand what reviews might be best for a specific new proposal that needs to be reviewed. This map, created in 2005, was at that point in time the most comprehensive, most global map of science ever created by Kevin Boyack and Dick Clavens. They have contributed many, many maps to the exhibit, and it's kind of interesting to see their evolution through the last 10, 20 years now, almost 18 years, to the point in time where they are now doing paper level maps, and that's, of course, a lot more entities to be mapping. You can also map intellectual property and intellectual landscapes, who claims what kind of IP. And using patents, US patents only, we created here that base map shown in the middle, which basically just plots all the classes in the USPTO classification hierarchy, not down to the 15th level, but the top 3 levels only. And then you can show what kind of prior art a patent has. So you can pull it out of the set of all the many patents, and you get to see where patents are in this hierarchy that are cited by this gold nanoshell patent shown here in the top right. Or you look at a patent on Gore-Tex, which many of you might own jackets or tents or shoes from, and you get to see how many other patents are now referring to that one patent. So you get to see citing and cited relationships to the quite large size of all the patents. You can also map Wikipedia because many use Wikipedia extensively to learn about mathematics, science, technology developments, and all the fancy terms that you would see in scientific publications. Wikipedia plays a really important role in lowering the floor for general audiences to understand scientific research. And so here you have a map that shows, again, a base map of all the English-speaking Wikipedia articles, and then overlaid you have mathematics, science, and technology entities. And in the corners you have articles that have been actively edited or had major edits or had bursts of activity, like somebody deleting it, abortion, bringing it back, deleting it again. All these things are happening and going on at Wikipedia. Some of you might like science fiction books, and here you see a map of science fiction where you can find books you already read, but then near to them might be books that you would also enjoy and that are close by. It's very much like Amazon or Netflix, which also are trying to recommend books and movies to you based on what you have already watched or read or purchased. And of course, all these maps are available online now. You can zoom into them and explore them in their full stunning beauty. And hopefully you get a chance to do that. And there are some links in the chat, and you might like to repost them if there are more people that joined since I started here. So here you have an overview of some of the interactive data visualizations that came available in the second decade of the exhibit. You have smelly maps that I will introduce in more detail. You have information on HathiTrust, which is a huge database of books and scholarly data. You have excellence networks. You have the Fleet Moon Explorer that shows massive numbers of ships going around our globe. It's really quite fascinating to just see this in that detail. And again, here is Smelly Maps, and you might recognize the city. Let's see if somebody recognizes it, and you could say it out loud or put your best guess in the chat. Anyone recognizes this city? And there are smelly maps for Barcelona. There are smelly maps for other major cities. It's not Paris, no, sorry.
Can that be London?
Yes, it is London. Wonderful. So what you see here is the River Thames. This is the zoo. All the green parks are the parks that you might have enjoyed when you visited London. And so the color coding here comes from Twitter data, which is coded for words that indicate emission, nature, food, animals, and waste. And people also run sentiment analysis over these geocoded tweets. And then you get to see which areas in London actually cause people to be joyful or fearful or disgusted or in anger. And again, if you now would hover over these segments of streets, you would actually get that data visualization to change for every single one. And for urban planners, it's very important to understand how a city is perceived locally and globally. And again, if you go to different cities, you will see more green or more red, more nature or more animal waste. Again, here animal waste is mostly the zoo area, but also some other areas. And it's interesting to then just explore a city in a very, very new way. And given that many keep geotags on their tweets, this becomes very feasible to be done for almost any area on our planet where people tweet, if they still tweet. This is another map which is called Mega Regions of the US. This data comes from a pre-pandemic time where people used to drive long distances from home to work and then in the evening back home. You see New York right here, and you see that some people have a 2-hour commute in the morning into New York and back in the evening. There are other commutes which are not as long, but these commutes then pull certain areas closer together, and now you can cluster it and draw boundaries around these commuting patterns. And that obviously changes and is different from these states in the US. So I'm currently in Bloomington, Indiana. If you see my mouse pointer, I'm about here. This is the state of Indiana, and Gary, Indiana is actually part of Indiana. But given that so many people are moving from Gary in the morning to Chicago and then back home, it now becomes part of the larger Chicago area. And if you have the specific areas in the US that you care deeply about, you might like to zoom into them and see what kind of impact they have in drawing people into metropolitan areas. And then there are people actually living in other areas. And again, this is pre-pandemic. It would be really super interesting to compare this to now, where people could live anywhere and still work for Silicon Valley, for instance. We have a number of friends, colleagues, which recently came back from the East Coast and the West Coast to Bloomington, Indiana. Much nicer style of living, much more greenery, lots of lakes, and much cheaper to live, but they still are making their money in very different states. You also have many other atlases and interactive data visualizations. And again, I hope you get a chance to go to scimaps.org and explore these visualizations, including different viruses, very appropriate for the pandemic. And this exhibit iteration came out during the pandemic. So we have been bringing the exhibit virtually to many places, but now also again in a more physical manner. And all of this would not be possible without the team. So here you see Liesel and Todd, which have been working together with me and many others on the curation of the exhibit and bringing it to many places. And then, of course, we have the exhibit advisory board, which has been essential and instrumental in helping us understand how to best advertise and communicate these maps to many, so that many benefit. every year we have a call for Macroscopes. The next submission deadline is February 15th, 2023. So if you are creating interactive data visualizations or you know of others creating them, we would love to have maps in French. We would love to have maps that show all kinds of data, and we very much welcome maps that are not by only US citizens. So please do help spread the word. And I think so far we have been very good in getting submissions from around the globe. Coming over to forecasts, I wonder how many of you have run computational predictive models. So in the chat, or maybe I see participants here, if you could raise your hand if you have done computational predictive models. So not just descriptive models, which take a data set and analyze it, but really trying to have a parameterizable model, machine learning model, network science model, cellular automata, dynamic equation models, any of those. Let's see if you have done this before. And I wonder if you could just give me a hands up. I guess I would need that in the list of participants. So Pierre has done it.
Katy, do you mean also experimental data modeling or just?
Yes. So you might like to model human behavior, absolutely. All of our flaws and problems that our brains cause us. Because many of you, including my husband, would try to model human cognition. And we know there are good things about human cognition and there are issues with human cognition. So I see one hand up. So maybe I will do a more detailed introduction into predictive models and what it takes. Thank you, Pierre, for helping me understand the audience. So if you would like to not just analyze a set of data, but to have an understanding of what happens if you, for instance, fund one area in a different way, or you assemble a different team, or you put a new course in place, what will happen in the future if you do that, right? So many science policymakers, which we work with, are very, very interested to simulate possible futures and then pick the most desirable one based on criteria they have prior identified. And so if you want to do that, then you need to get familiar with different types of models. And so there are obviously expert-based models where you bring together a room full of experts and you ask them, okay, which technology developments are likely to happen in the next 5 years, 10 years, 50 years? And what kind of radical changes might happen to us because of global warming or automation or robots moving in, etc. And then based on all of that expert data, you try to predict the future, and you might even create a report that is shared widely and helps anyone understand what the future might hold for us. But that's expert-based. That doesn't use any data necessarily, even though expert might be empowered by looking at some data, but it also doesn't use any algorithms. Then there are so-called descriptive models, and those models would look at the data set, let's say classroom activity for the course I taught. And I could then understand how students took different lectures, did their homework or didn't do it, got a certain grade, or got some other elements that they might have liked to have, like a portfolio item, for instance. And that's just analyzing that data so that I can improve that course, right? But it's not predicting what would happen if I change the structure of the course, for instance. That's where predictive models really come in. And these predictive models, they help us simulate futures. So you take data, let's say data of temperatures over the last 100 years or 1,000 years, and then you try to predict forward what it might be like under different scenarios. I think you have seen those global warming predictions. Or another type of prediction you might have seen is weather forecasts or climate forecasts for that matter. So these kind of predictions, they can also be done for science and technology and job markets and educational landscapes. And it's interesting to understand how to best use this kind of information, but also ultimately how to use the data that now exists to create better model results. And this entire atlas is about the history of modeling. So why would we even model? Which kind of models? History of how these models have been used, but also models that have had a huge impact on how people understood their world and how they acted. And then under methods, you have overviews, and I will show you a few details there. And then you have these expert-based models and how they are typically set up and what types exist, and descriptive models, which are the main type of models that are used in science technology studies. And then predictive models, which are new, but absolutely have been used to predict futures. And then you see different models in action from population and natural resources models to climate and weather, transportation, digitization, urbanization. And these are also substrates on which we live, right? If you have a certain street system, you can then have Amazon trucks deliver all kinds of stuff. If you have more railroads, maybe some of this traffic should go onto railroads. But as you know, in the US, there are very few railroads left because the car industry was very powerful and still is. So you can then take that existing substrate with which you have to live because you can't change it so quickly. And you can then start creating different types of models based on questions you might have. And then you can do that for micro level environments, meso level environments, and macro level environments. So just me and my needs, or an entire team, or an entire university like Indiana University, or going global education, for instance. How can this be modeled and has been modeled, and what do we know of what works and what doesn't work? So these are case studies, if you wish. And then you have more science maps so that you get to see the last 3 iterations of the exhibit. And then there is part 5, which explains modeling opportunities, but also how to reduce human bias, which we do know exists, and we have to massively counteract it, because otherwise we will have bad solutions for our futures. And then building modeling capacity, which many teams and industries are trying to do. And then actionable forecasts. So it doesn't matter if you understand something, if you can't act on it. Sometimes you just don't have the rights or permission or authority to act on certain insights you have. And so it's always good to understand what your range of action is so that you can empower everybody to do the right actions. And of course, some of these insights are so big that people will find means to act on them, I hope. So ultimately, this could not have been possible without many, many meetings we had around the globe again, with many experts being deeply interested in how to model science, technology, education, job market landscapes. And here you see what it typically takes to model. So there are different model classes, and you might be familiar with the levels, the concerns, and the types of models here. And on the right-hand side here, you have the typical process of how you go from a target system, let's say an educational system in a state of the US, to a non-formal model description, just a verbal description of what you want to understand and what data exists and what algorithms exist, to a formal model where you typically need to bring in some person who actually knows how to create models of the educational landscape here. And then you need a computer scientist to get us to an executable model, some kind of pseudocode that some programmer can implement. And then, of course, it needs to be run either on the cloud or in high-performance computing centers, because oftentimes there's a lot of data that gets crunched and predicted and analyzed. And then results of the modeling effort need to be communicated back and analyzed and interpreted and applied to the target system. And this is non-trivial and oftentimes takes a lot of expertise and a lot of milkshakes, I would say, because you have to really deeply understand what these different experts know, and they oftentimes speak different languages. So this might be a policymaker. This is a physicist, maybe, who knows about modeling, agent-based models. Computer scientists speak, again, a different language from the physicist or the educational policymaker. And of course, the programmer is in a different world yet again, because he just cares of how to most efficiently implement that code using multiple GPUs. So all of this has to be translated this way and then that way. And that's why it's really, really hard actually to get a model that really is useful. However, if you agree on phenomena of interest, then you can use those to pick right models. And then you also know how to get from a certain insight need to an algorithm that has been applied before and that has been shown to be useful. And so if you look at these phenomena of interest, you oftentimes have seasonality. If you are a farmer, you know that there's a difference between winter and summer. If you interested in diffusion, then you might pick a very, very different type of modeling system. Many of us are interested in network growth, how different expertise networks, for instance, grow over time. You might be focused on positive and negative feedback cycles. And again, that's a different type of models you can then use. And so you can take these phenomena and the different model classes, which are also detailed in this book, and you can look at what kind of target systems have been studied using these model classes to help us understand different phenomena. And this is not a complete linking of all of these phenomena, model classes, and target systems, but hopefully it gives you an idea that there can be a very systematic process of what we know and what has worked before and the algorithms and model classes that exist. And so in the modeling framework, you have this iterative process where you get data, you model the data, you then visualize the results, you explore the results, translate it back to your stakeholders, see if it makes a difference, if it's actionable. Oftentimes people then want to zoom into a certain area, so you need more data for that area. You model and analyze the data again, you visualize again, and it's oftentimes multiple rounds before you have something that can be really used. And so it's very time consuming, or used to be, but now there are model libraries which are highly modular. And then you can plug and play different data visualizations and data analysis and data models. Ultimately, you want to visualize the results, and some of the visualizations are purposefully similar, very simple, because you want to know exactly what parameters had what impact on your modeling results. However, in other works, as you will see, you can also do quite stunning data visualizations of diffusion patterns, for instance, or network growth models. But here you have typically very, very simple model visualizations. Model validation is super, super important because some models are pretty simple and you have low business risk, and then you might just need normal version control so that you can reproduce everything done, and maybe some testing and training for everybody involved. But then there are others which have a high business risk, like for instance, weather predictions would be in that area. And they use highly complex models. And then you need a lot of validation because you need to make sure that what you predict is actually accurate for all conditions and for all purposes that this model is intended to be used for. And you have to also tell when not to use that model, because otherwise people trust it and they might get in trouble if these predictions are not correct. And then again, the book also explains 10 different models. I picked a few here just to pique your interest. And so you have cellular automata. Some of you might have played The Game of Life. It's a great, fun piece of work and very insightful also. It also exists in 3D, by the way, if you want to try that one. And it kind of just shows you how it evolves over time. Many of you might be familiar with Schelling segregation model. Again, there are also great online sites which really help you understand what is happening there. And all of the links to the online interactive resources are in the book, of course. And so you can just go to references for page 41, this title, and you will get all the scholarly publications, but also the interactive online websites. And again, you can now look at cellular automata, which are right here, and they are connected to Schelling segregation model, and then also the Eden growth model, which is also explained here. In general, you might be interested in answering temporal questions, like when questions, or where questions that requires geospatial models, or what questions where you need to bring in linguistic models. or network models, which oftentimes answer with whom question. Who talked with whom? Who married whom? Who was in love with whom? Who told whom what? So I think these kind of questions, and you already saw that there was one where whom told whom what, you actually have topical and network now together, right? So oftentimes you want to animate over time a network growth model, for instance. So you have temporal and networks in there, or you want to see how a piece of information or misinformation flows in a network. So you have a topical plus network model together. And so it becomes just more interesting as you have more interesting questions. I mentioned human bias, and again, there are many that we know about, and we can counteract them professionally and strongly, and I think that will make our world a much, much better world. And so here at Indiana University, we actually have workshops and courses where new hires get trained in dealing with these biases when it comes to hiring, when it comes to dealing with different ethnicities, when it comes to teaching students in ways that they are comfortable with. And I hope this continues in other institutions also. Before I go to the next slides, let's see if there are any questions.
Let's open it and then let's see. I have several, and you can you can say if the questions are better deferred to the very end, that you'll cover it later, because I have several on this module here. And the first one, in fact, I'll ask, can you give some examples of biases?
Yeah, there is, for instance, the set of biases which are listed here. So there's a gender bias. Oftentimes now violin hiring events are done behind a curtain, because it's known that typically male violinists are hired and females don't really have a chance. But if you have them perform with their instrument behind a curtain, many more female violinists will be getting hired. You also have a generational bias. You have an own species bias. You prefer members of your own species. You have an exposure bias, and there's a lot of scholarly data and experiments behind each one of those biases. And we also now have first evidence how you can counteract these biases.
Can I ask a general question about the atlas itself? I'm sure you're asked all the time. I mean, the atlas is an object. It's not a virtual atlas. It has virtual sides. Why the physical object at all?
That is a really good question. So we have been bringing the exhibit to many places, and people oftentimes encounter the exhibit not knowing that it was there. So obviously there are opening events where people are invited and they bring an hour of time, but sometimes they are in public libraries or in national academies or galleries, and then people go there and out of nowhere there are 100 maps. And in order to study these 100 maps, if you just want to spend 5 minutes on each, it's 500 minutes. So you don't have that necessarily. So there was this interest by many to sit down with a book and to really read about not just the maps, but also the map makers, the goals that the map makers had when making the maps, the impact these maps had over time. And many of them have been used not just once, but many, many times over now decades. And it's interesting then to not just have the maps with a cover and a back of a book, but also talk about how you can actually do this systematically, to have a framework that explains how others can make their own maps, that explains what the open challenges are. And this is just for the maps, right? The interactive data visualizations, totally different beast. Now you have interactive data streaming in and you have to interact with that data. And so that requires a different type of framework. So that was the second atlas. But then we got more and more requests for predictions, for computational predictive models. And so the third atlas really covers that topic. And we don't have so many interactive data visualizations that actually have predictive models inside of them, but they oftentimes try to show us the past so that we can make better decisions for the future. And I'm a deep believer that the more you can go backwards, the more you can go forward. So you have to be a good steward of your history. and keep good track of what has been done and tried before so that you can make better predictions in the future.
I have many more questions, but I have one last one before you go on to the next phase, which is, I'm sure you're also asked often, what about timeliness? I mean, isn't it the case that when you make an object like the atlas, it's immediately out of date?
Yeah, that's a great question also. So in the teachings we distinguish timely knowledge that students need to have to get their foot in the door for the next job. So we teach them a lot of tools that are currently widely used and are the top of their state of the art. In terms of frameworks or general computational ideas or modeling approaches and concepts, those types of knowledge are almost like mathematics. So they should be true in 50 years, 100 years. There will be better and additional models, but many of these basic principles of how you can create a computational predictive model will not change, and in fact hasn't changed. Some of these models are rather old, but at one point or another, they were applied to science itself, and that's the moment when we pick them, and we just tell about it. And so that's what the third atlas really does. And I think the atlases do have the ambition to capture the state of the art as it existed at that moment in time. But they also have the ambition to capture forever knowledge, because that knowledge might still be relevant and valuable in 10 years and 20 years. I believe it will be.
Okay, thanks. Has there never been a second edition or a third edition?
For the atlases, no. For the textbooks, yes.
I see. Okay, guys, thank you very much. And please go on to your second module.
Yeah, great question, Phil. So we recently had an event at the Futurium in Berlin. If you have not been recently to Berlin, right next to the train station, the main train station, 5 minutes, you have this new building, which is the Futurium, or Museum of the Future. And it welcomes scholarly events. So we booked a number of rooms in the Futurium for an event on the future of learning and work. And in that workshop, which brought together people from OECD, from many countries in Europe, but also experts from the US, we had a unique opportunity to discuss developments in the learning and educational workspaces. And of course, we can also map these spaces. And it's really interesting to see how the proliferation of artificial intelligence and automation and robotics really renders many jobs that were held by humans obsolete. These jobs will not need any human beings anymore. And the experts and human beings which hold these jobs right now, they need to be informed that this is going on so that they can get themselves courses and an update to their career trajectory and get out of these jobs, because very soon, for instance, truck drivers and others might not be needed anymore, or bank teller experts. All these are jobs that can be easily done by automating these jobs. And so how do you deal with this? And I think it's wonderful to then see also some of the neat new ideas and approaches across the European landscape, but also here in the US, where there are many career counselors are now using extensive data sets to help people which are in these situations, which are holding these jobs right now. Another line of research we are very excited about is to see how big science projects unfold over sometimes 30 years. So we compared here some of the main astronomy projects with large-scale projects in physics, like some of them are listed here in the lower left. You also have the Human Genome Project, and that's now compared with HubMap and the Human Cell Atlas, which my team is part of. And so it's interesting how teams initially form, how they perform ultimately, how they go through a pilot phase, which shows feasibility, and then go over into a production phase with massive numbers of people, 20,000 people on one paper, right? Listed as authors, but also very different structures in terms of how PhD students and postdocs are operating in those large-scale projects. And we created first visualizations of how these teams really function over time, what kind of areas of science they target, how different projects evolve from publishing in one area, but then publishing in more and more areas, kind of taking over the landscape of science as they unfold. And of course, some of the biomedical projects down here in the lower left on the right-hand side, they have very highly interdisciplinary publication outputs. And so it's really super fascinating to see how these teams evolve over 20, 30 years in some cases. So if you're interested in this, this might be another paper you might like to read, and I put that in the chat as well. For those of you which are interested in science of science studies and informatics and scientometrics and webometrics, we are bringing the ISC conference to Bloomington, Indiana this coming summer in July 2023, and it's close to you. So the deadline is coming up soon in December. There's also another deadline for posters next year, beginning of next year. So please do consider submitting to this conference, and come visit us and see us. And there will be many, many experts which all deeply care about how to analyze and visualize science and technology, but also how to make it actionable for policymakers. So typically this conference goes to major capitals like Berlin or Rio or Rome, the imperial city. That was the last in-person conference. But this time we bring it to Bloomington, Indiana, but we will make sure that some of the Washington, DC experts are also coming here. And we have, I think, 17 faculty members at IU, which all do science of science studies. And we're very excited to bring it here. And we have 150 network scientists. So I think that's why we got the okay to host it here. Super exciting. Also, last year we had a 24-hour science mapping event. 24 hours, you start on a Saturday noon and it ends on a Sunday noon. And we had so much fun. We are going to do this again. And we have it this year from December 10, not this coming Saturday, but the Saturday next week, to December 11 noon. So over 24 hours, you can come in any moment in time to hear more about what it takes to map the human body at single cell resolution, which is a project that my team is also involved in. And it's massive and super challenging and complex because there are 37 trillion cells that make up the human body. And it's non-trivial to map them all. All right, any questions? Let's see. Or should I just go over to how to actually create data visualizations? Or we could discuss what you just saw. I'm very easy to do what is most useful for you.
How do they do the human body cell mapping? I mean, what is the actual procedure?
So this is a good question, and I'm happy to explain this for hours. There's actually a recent presentation that Jeff Spraggins from Vanderbilt University and myself gave to a general audience. We at that moment in time, we were the co-chairs of HubMap. And so that explains how many tissue mapping centers, these are biomedical research centers, which run single cell assays for healthy human tissue data. So these are oftentimes tissue samples that were donated by healthy human beings. Like there's an entire breast tissue data bank, which we have in Indianapolis, where healthy human female go and have biopsies done on their breasts so that friends and family members hopefully never ever die again on breast cancer. And there are other procedures where organs were secured for organ transplants, but then couldn't be used for that purpose. And so in this moment, we get to use them for HubMap. And then there are other ways to get human tissue by sampling, for instance, near to a tumor, and then the pathologist declares that this is healthy human tissue. And this way it gets used. So it's actually non-trivial to get to the human tissue that's healthy, because people don't like to give it up except for placenta. So we have a lot of placenta material because whenever a baby is born, you also have a placenta that becomes available. People don't mind giving up adipose fat tissue. That's another type of tissue you can get. Skin punch biopsies are easy to get. But then you take that tissue and you run it through different technological workflows to do microscopy. That's maybe familiar to most of you, but also do single cell genomic and proteomic analysis. So for each cell, you will know what genes are inside of that cell, all 47,000, because you have 22,000 human genes, but also mitochondrial genes. You also will have proteins, surface proteins, but also inside of the cells proteins. And you can analyze those. And from the combination of different genes and proteins, you can infer what cell type you're actually looking at. And then given many, many cells per cubic millimeter. So 1 cubic millimeter has about 1 million cells. So we are talking about a lot of data. You can then start to systematically sample parts of our human body to get more information on what cells and cell states exist for which human beings. And of course, human beings change in age, they change in BMI. In some cases, they do come from different ethnicities, different genders. So mapping human diversity as we have it across 8 billion people is non-trivial, especially given the fact that it typically costs about 50 cents per cell. So if you want to probe 2 cells, you pay $1. So it's super expensive still, but super exciting also because these technologies are now available to create a map of the human body.
You said what was easy to get. What's the hardest to get?
So we are trying to create a map of the human body based on the vasculature, because that actually goes across levels, right? You have the aorta, which is a rather big vessel, going down to microvasculatures, where basically you have one cell which fits through them, right? And that scale difference is actually not easy to capture, but in order to build a vasculature-based common coordinate framework, we basically need information and names for all the vessels in the human body. And the large vessels are very well understood and named, and you can look at them in anatomy books, but the microvasculature is not well named and not well understood. And so getting that for the entire human body is hard.
And that's not a particular part of the human body, it's all over the vasculature, yeah.
Yeah. And those of you which have seen the Body World exhibit might have seen that you could strip away everything but the vasculature, and you would still see the human body. You would still be able to take a fingerprint on your phone and open it up this way. So it's everywhere, and it's very detailed.
Very interesting. Okay, please do go ahead, Katy.
More minutes do I have, Steven, for the slides?
Since you let me interrupt you, you still have a good deal of time.
So I believe I have another meeting coming up at 11:30. I have 12 more minutes.
Okay. Normally we end at noon, but this is fine. Okay, use the time as you wish. Go ahead. Okay,
sorry, I didn't know. So data visualization literacy, you actually have a paper for this in the chat. Please do feel free to follow up on it. But in general, we believe that in order to increase data visualization literacy for many on this planet, you have to not just be able to read data visualizations, but also make them. And this is very much in line with, for instance, mathematical literacy. You don't just get to see formulas, you get to solve them. Or literacy, the ability to read and write. You don't just get to read, you are asked to write things also. And similarly, we believe you need to be able to read and write data visualizations to really understand how they work and when they should not be used, for instance. So the framework is really focusing not just on reading, but also on constructing data visualizations. And of course, it builds on prior work in cartography, psychology, cognitive science, statistics, scientific visualization, data visualization, learning sciences, because all of these sciences have contributed to our understanding of how we can read and write. The data visualization literacy frameworks then was developed over the last 20 years. And that is with a lot of students taking courses here at IU, which have been using that framework in its different versions. And also students then working on hundreds, literally hundreds of client projects. So every spring we teach students and for 8 weeks, and then the other 7 weeks they work on external client projects guided by us. And so students taking this course, they get to see 20 student projects go forward, and they will get to recognize that getting your hands on really high quality data is really important, because if you don't have good data, everything else doesn't really matter. If you have bad data and you try to analyze, model it, it's not going to be really good what you get there. And so with all that input from teaching it so many times and running it through so many different projects, we then got to a typology of different data visualization literacy elements, such as insight needs, data scales, analysis, visualizations, graphic symbols, graphic variables, and interactions. But also we have a data visualization literacy workflow process, which defines 5 steps. So you have a stakeholder, could be yourself. You get the best data you can afford and compile in the time you have. You get to analyze or model that data. You visualize it, you then deploy your visualization, and you interpret your visualization. And you can take these 2 parts and you can overlay them. So here you have the overlay of both. You see this is a cyclic process, which you typically go through many, many times. You can exemplify this and add more information. And so here you see that you take your insight needs and you operationalize them, just like you read a math problem in a book, in a mathematics book, a verbal description of a problem. You operationalize it, you create formulas from it, right, that you can solve. Here, similarly, you compile it into something that you can run through an algorithm so that you can visualize it. You have to pick a reference system and then overlay different data, graphic symbols or graphic variable types. And then you interact with that visualization, you interpret it, translate it back to the stakeholders. If it's yourself and you do this all yourself, maybe that's the easiest, but oftentimes that's not the case. Oftentimes there are 10 people with different types of expertise involved in this kind of data visualization effort or data modeling effort. And so then you have to translate it back. And for the course we are teaching, we have developed a so-called Make-A-Vis environment where you can upload a data set, you can make a visualization by picking a visualization type, picking graphic symbol types, picking graphic variable types, and then you get simple visualizations that help you understand the linkage between the graphic elements and the raw data. I think you have to see both at once so that you see how this raw data is converted into a visual representation. And so here you have different elements of each of these types. And you can then zoom into insight needs, and you get to see that many people have worked on this, like Bertin in 1967 in a French book, wrote about selection, order, quantity, and association. And then many after him tried to codify and define different types of insight needs. And then here you have what's used in the atlas, but also used in the framework. So you have categorize or cluster, you have order, rank, and sort, you have looking for distributions, you have comparisons between 2 data sets, for instance, you have looking for trends, geospatial patterns, compositions also of text, and then networks where you look for correlations or relationships. So these are the major insight needs that you might encounter. And based on those, you can then pick different types of data and analysis and visualizations. And here you see just a few of them. There are actually 200 visualization types now, and all of them have very specific names. And we are also teaching these names in the InfoVis course. And then it's important to understand that there is typically a reference system, such as a row and a column in a table, or XY coordinates in a graph, or latitude, longitude in a map, or even in network visualizations where you look for placing nodes so that edge crossings are avoided and similar nodes are close by. Even here you have an XY coordinate system that you actually use to overlay other data. So as soon as you know that there are these reference systems, then you can overlay other data. So here you again have a reference system down here, and then you overlay data such as graphic symbols or graphic variables. And these graphic symbols and graphic variables, there are many of them. You might be familiar with graphic variable types. Optics, texture, and motion are not so well supported by the existing tools, but there are now new tools which have more of this information. We do know which ones are easy for human beings and which ones are hard. And of course, these are large tables that are now at your disposal for encoding data in visual form. And so here you have the graphic variable types, and across you have the graphic symbol types. And actually this table is way, way bigger. And it's also in the Atlas of Knowledge, which is the second book. And if this is interesting to you, you're very welcome to come in for the Visual Analytics Certificate course, which we teach again January 9 to February 19 in 2023. And we have run this course with many of the IU students, but of course also with more senior students from industry, government, and also not-for-profit organizations, because they all are interested to convert their information and their data into actionable knowledge. And so just to wrap up, there are a number of important open challenges. Like recently I had the opportunity to be part of a committee that worked on a National Academy report on accelerating behavioral science through ontology development and use. The report is now out. We had Mark Moosen visit IU and give a panel here to our psychologists and cognitive scientists, which often are not interested in ontologizing their work, because first of all, it's a lot of work and maybe they're not paid for that necessarily. Second, many have the fear that it would hold them accountable. But I think what it really does is that it connects psychology and cognitive science work to very rich ontologies that exist for the biomedical sciences. And at a time and age when many of us, many of my students are also very much challenged by the pandemic and are mentally challenged. I think in that time and age, you absolutely must find ways, you all must find ways to codify your knowledge and make it available to those which are trying to treat, trying to help. Because otherwise it's in publications, but it can't be easily accessed. So I think there is a huge need for behavioral scientists to make that knowledge easier to access. We are working on other projects that try to visualize some of these ontologies that are now brought together, and many of them are biomedical ontologies, but also food items and COVID disease relevant ontologies. And this is important for advancing these ontologies, but also for communicating their coverage to general audiences. And then those of you which want to know more about the Human Reference Atlas, there's a new paper out, and it also links to other work on this topic. So you're very welcome to follow up on that. And I'm happy to talk more about it. And then last but not least, please do come join us next July here in Bloomington, Indiana. And I would be happy to answer questions.